Rishi Sunak, he's out and about today in the northwest of England, and we're expecting to hear from him later this morning at a press conference.
Well, in his first outing of the new year yesterday, the Prime Minister was asked about when he thinks a general election will happen.
My working assumption is we'll have a general election in the second half of this year, and in the meantime I've got lots that I want to get on with. This Saturday we'll be introducing a significant tax cut for millions of people in work, worth on average £450 for an average worker. Because we've halved inflation, we want to keep managing the economy well and cutting people's taxes, and I want to keep tackling illegal migration. And we cut the number of arrivals last year by over a third, but we've got more to do, and we want to get the Rwanda scheme through Parliament and up and running. So look, I've got plenty to get on with, and that's what I'm focused on doing, delivering for the British people.
In response, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, accused Rishi Sunak of being a squatter in number 10.
Joining us now, Conservative MP Philip Davies is with us. Good morning, Philip. Thanks for joining us. So is the thinking that an election in the latter part of the year is because Sunak wants Brits to feel the economic effects of his policies, inflation falling, interest rates falling, mortgages coming down? Is that the kind of thinking behind it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was always pretty fanciful to think there was going to be an election in May because, there's two parts to it, Ben, let's be honest about it. One is that, yes, the government needs to sort out the Rwanda scheme. It needs to deal with illegal immigration and legal immigration, for that matter. There's no route to a victory for the Conservatives at the election without tackling immigration. We want to keep cutting taxes, and we want the effects of that to be felt by people before there's an election. But, frankly, we can all look at the opinion polls. I don't think you need to be Professor John Curtis to see that we are in a difficult position in the opinion polls. And I think it was always pretty fanciful to think that the Prime Minister would call an election when we're so far behind in the polls.
You say fanciful, Philip, but what he said yesterday, it seemed very carefully worded. He said the working assumption is that there'll be a general election in the second half of the year. That could still be an election come May. It's only his working assumption.
Yeah, I don't think any Prime Minister is ever going to box themselves in and say it's going to be on a particular date when they don't need to do that. But I think, if you were a betting person, Pip, I don't know if you are or not, I think you would have always wagered that it was more likely to be later in the year rather than earlier in the year. I don't actually think he's told us anything that we didn't really think ourselves anyway.
Philip, can I ask you about a column from Richard Littlejohn in the Mail today? He said that why is it the Tories have a divine right to rule, and maybe that the Tories should stand down for the surging Reform UK. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think any of us think we've got a divine right to rule. We've all been there through the bad times as well as the good times politically. When I got elected to Parliament, we were in opposition. Ben, so I can assure you that people like me know that we don't have a divine right to rule. We've been there when we haven't been in office, but that's the reason why we think it's so important that we do remain in office, because we've seen that the damage that's done by a Labour government, and ultimately it's down to the voters. But of course, under the first past the post system, we all know there's either going to be a Conservative government or a Labour government. That's just the facts of the matter. Everybody knows that, and so. The question is for people at the election is which of those two alternatives do they prefer? It's going to be one or the other.
Sorry, Phil. The Tories are scared of reform, aren't they? Lee Anderson the other night said that Richard Tice was a pound shop Farage and that he was Reform's version of Diane Abbott. Isn't that the language of a party that's fearful of a rival?
No, look, we're not reform or an irrelevance in this to a certain extent. I like Richard Tice. I consider myself a friend of Richard Tice. I'm certainly not going to criticise Richard Tice. He's a good guy, and I probably agree with him on more things than I disagree with him. But the fact of the matter is, reform are an irrelevance here, because at the end, it's the voters who might think about voting reform that are the issue, not reform, the Reform Party in itself. Ultimately, we've got to persuade people that they are much better off having a Conservative government than a Labour government. And if they feel that, they'll vote Conservative at the election. That is our task. The only reason people will vote Reform, who used to vote Conservative at the election, is if they feel it doesn't matter whether there's a Labour government or a Conservative government. And in which point, this is all down to us. This is nothing to do with Reform. Reform will not make any impact on the election at all. It's us that will make an impact on the election, and we've got to do what we can to win back those voters who we have lost. Reform are an irrelevance in this. This is all down to us. We need to win these voters back through what we do, and it won't make any difference what Reform say, and it won't make any difference if we criticise Reform or not. We've got to win these voters back by concentrating on what we do.
Philip, I am quite surprised that you say so confidently that Reform are an irrelevance, because they could take votes away from the Tory party, they could take votes away from Labour. We might end up with no overall majority here.
No, of course, the Reform are going to get people who vote for them. Of course they are. But they're not. They're only voting. It's a protest vote in effect. They would be voting Reform because they were unhappy with what we were doing as the government. That's why they want to vote for Reform. So my point is that our future is in our own hands here. We've got to win those voters back. If Reform don't stand at the election, or whether they stand at the election, is neither here nor there. Because if people don't feel that they're better off having a Conservative government than a Labour government, they won't vote Conservative anyway, whether there's a Reform candidate standing or not. So Reform in that regard are an irrelevance. It's what we do that counts. We've got to persuade people between now and the general election that they are much better off with a Conservative government rather than a Labour government. Even if they're not entirely happy with a Conservative government, we've got to persuade them that we are much better than Labour. And if we can do that, they'll vote Conservative. If we can't do that, they'll either vote Reform, or they won't vote at all, or they'll vote for another party. So it doesn't really matter about the other parties. Our future is in our own hands. We've got to win these people back by our own actions.
Well, the argument, Phil, is that that's where the Tories will come a cropper, because Nigel Farage said this week that distrust among traditional Tory voters has reached a level not seen in modern times. Farage, of course, is the honorary president of Reform, the party of which is pretty much the Brexit party. A lot of the same faces, a lot of behind-the-scenes workers are still the same. And let's not forget, Boris Johnson and the Tories asked the Brexit party to stand aside in 2019. It's been argued that the Brexit party allowed Boris to surge to that victory. So I think they would contest your claim that they are irrelevant this time round.
Well, they're irrelevant in the sense that they're a symptom. They're not the cause. The Reform Party's position in the polls is a symptom of our problems. It's a symptom of the fact that we've lost the confidence of so many people. Our job is not to attack the Reform Party or to worry about what they're doing. We just need to focus on what we're doing. That's my point. We've got to focus on what we're doing. It's the voters who are thinking about voting Reform that are the issue, not the Reform Party itself. And we've got to try and appeal to each and every one of them and persuade them that a Conservative government is in their interests more than a Labour government, because it's going to be one or the other. That's my point. I'm saying that what Reform say and do is relevance in that sense. It's what we say and do that actually matters, and will determine whether those people vote for Reform or not. It won't be the Reform Party that persuades those people to vote for the Reform. It will be their verdict on us that will determine how they vote, and that's why we've got to win them back.
Well, you've had a good go at it in the last 5 minutes. Thank you ever so much, Conservative MP for Shipley, Philip Davis. Thank you.
I know people think that the election's nailed on Labour, but anything can happen. I mean, in 2016, the infamous New York Times front page of Clinton 99% nailed on to win against Trump, and of course Donald Trump went and won that election. So anything can happen. Philip's quite right.
And what will be interesting as well is how dirty this campaign's going to get as well.
Yeah, exactly.